Well, welcome everybody. So good to see so many shining faces on such a dreary day. I'm Lori Factor, president of the Youngstown Press Club board, and I'm so happy to welcome all of you and welcome the teams from the American Journalism Project and Signal Cleveland. A few housekeeping items. Obviously, every single time I want to make sure that Diane and Joanne are acknowledged, because without them, none of this would happen. So let's just take a minute and do a nice little round of applause, huh? Special thanks to the Public Library of Youngstown and Mahoning County for sponsoring our event. They've become such a nice partner, and we appreciate the use of this space, and it is just lovely. And shout out to them for their levy renewal. We're all glad that happened. Our community is better because of our library. This is our last event in the speaker series. It has been funded by the Edward M. Barr Fund, and we are very grateful that we've been able to bring in such quality speakers. But this brings us to the conclusion of 2024, and we've got some fun things planned or in the works for 2025. We do have a members holiday event at the Avalon on December 10th, so that is just sort of a drop-in. And when I tell you it's fun, I mean, you can't get a bunch of media professionals and communication professionals together without it being really fun. So please make it a point and drop in. And then last, please join me in inviting Mary Ellen Huesken to introduce our speakers.
Hello, it's good to see all of you. I worked at the Vindicator from 1986 through 1988. My last day there was the same as Tim Fitzpatrick's last day. So I'm now working as the copy editor for Signal Cleveland and for Signal Akron. And we'd like to introduce Loretta Chao from the American Journalism Project and Mark Naymik from Signal Statewide and Signal Cleveland. He's a longtime reporter and journalist in the Cleveland area.
Okay, I'm gonna try to. Can everyone hear me? Great. I just want to start off by thanking you all so much for inviting us here. I feel very honored. Youngstown has an important role in the history of journalism and local journalism in the U.S. and has produced so many phenomenal, talented journalists. So I feel very humbled to be here as an advocate for the field, and also to be with my colleagues from Signal, Ohio. So thank you so much. I'm going to, I'll give you a little rundown of the plan for today. I will talk about my organization, the American Journalism Project, and sort of what we learned from our work investing in local news around the country, and which has led us to meet my colleagues here from Signal, Ohio, and talk a little bit about the industry context that is sort of like what's developing in local news in the recent years. And also some of the movements that have been born sort of around the country, one of which, the strongest of which, is here in Ohio, and we're super excited. I've spent a lot of my time here in the last few years and have really fallen in love with it, and I'm just very inspired by the folks that are at the forefront of everything we're doing. So one last thing before I start is I think that what's happening in national news is actually very like a strong indicator for how important local news and the work that local news reporters have in their communities, and how much we need people to feel a connection to the place where they live and a connection to each other. So I feel really energized, even more so now, to be in this work. So I'm going to start with something that's going to be no surprise to anyone in this room, but the local news industry has been declining for a long time. We've lost thousands of newspapers. There are thousands of communities across the country that have lost their newspaper and are left without local news. not to say that newspapers are the only producers of local news, but what we have found at the American Journalism Project in our research, that tends to be a very high producer of the volume of local original reporting in a place. So this has really had an effect on the country in terms of polarization, in terms of unchecked government spending and decisions that really need more accountability. So that's what we're finding, and we were sort of created as an organization to address this crisis. A lot of that is because the revenue model for local news prior to the beginning of this nonprofit movement was very focused on ad revenue, very focused on subscriptions. Not that that's bad. I think those things still need to continue, but because of disruption in those two types of revenue, we need to find a different way to sustain local news at the level that we had it before. To give you an idea of why we looked into nonprofit, when you have an ad or subscriber-based model, your incentive structures are a bit different. They're focused on capturing as much attention as possible, so it's got a lot more competition involved in that type of model. What we've seen as a result is that a lot of local news media organizations that have been forced to sort of go broader in their coverage, they need more eyeballs, so focusing on a community that might be smaller is a little bit counter to their ability to stay afloat. So there's a little bit of a tension there. The difference with a philanthropic model is not that you're fully dependent on philanthropy, but rather you're adding philanthropy to the model so that you're more diversified and you're more resilient. So when the ad market is a little bit challenged, or when your subscriber, you don't have a huge subscriber base, there is another way to sustain your organization. So that's the sort of model we're going to talk about today. In nonprofit news, this has been an industry that's been growing for over a decade now. It started with national organizations that you may have heard of, like ProPublica and Marshall Project and things like that. That sort of paved the way to show that there is a way to do independent, high-quality journalism with philanthropic support. That paved the way to a lot of openings of investigative journalism nonprofits and at a local level, and state government nonprofits at a local level, and they started to grow. There were examples like the Texas Tribune that have come up that have grown to over $10 million in budget. So it's given some hope that there is a sort of way to sustain local news organizations. And then in the last several years, what we've seen is just hundreds of local news nonprofits also springing up everywhere at different sizes. Some are really tiny, but we've got some that are really bright spots and that are demonstrating that when communities come together, they can really start and sustain something in the long run. AJP, the American Journalism Project, was started in 2019 to catalyze more funding for local news because while there are national foundations that supports journalism generally, we know that the problem is so much more than what any one or couple foundations can really sustain, and what it's going to take is funders who care about the future of the places where they are in their communities to understand the value of journalism in those communities. So that's sort of how we got started. We invest, we have a couple programs. We invest in existing organizations, so in places where there are already nonprofit newsrooms that are poised to grow. We provide grants to build up their business and operating capacity so that they can grow into lasting institutions. And in places where that doesn't exist, we offer a sort of like community listening program that can take a while, because what we want to do is identify what people believe or what people say they need as far as news and information, and then identify ways that there can be a program designed around what people actually want. So our vision is that by 2040, we'll have an independent, resilient, and ubiquitous civic press that will represent, inform, and engage every member of the diverse public it serves. So we have now 49 grantees around the country. And we're not yet in every state, but the goal is to keep growing, because even we don't even see it as at a state level. We think for people, local is their own community, so we hope to see that this is kind of blooming everywhere. So the wonderful thing about my work is that I get to work with phenomenal journalists, but also amazing civic leaders and philanthropists and people who are just interested in strengthening their local democracies. And that has resulted in the creation of several movements that are really worth noting. Signal Ohio is one of them. So it launched in Cleveland with its first newsroom in 2022, and is now in Akron. Has a statewide newsletter that I hope everybody has checked out. That was started, was it September, Mark? October.
First week.
And is growing to more places, and the idea being that when you are a network, partially it's you want to keep resources as local as possible, but you want to operate in a sustainable way where you can share some of the resources that can be shared. So that's sort of how that works, and my colleagues here can explain that more in a bit. We also have seen movements in Indiana, in Houston, and LA, where local, very broad and diverse coalitions of local leaders have come together in support of this. And I'll note too that a great thing about nonprofit news is that it's very collaborative. So it's more about impact and reaching people than necessarily about eyeballs. So when your stream of income is not just coming from advertisements, but also from foundations who are asking to see outcomes and measurable impact, that really changes your ability to think outside of the box about how you're reaching people, whether that's on social media, whether that's in printouts and through events and things like that, because at the end of the day, it's about whether you're getting journalism out to the people who need it. So, I'm almost done, I promise. So some of the examples here you'll see are nonprofit organizations around the country that are really not just serving their communities, but doing really exciting, innovative things. I'll just point out a couple. We'll talk a bunch about Signal today and its flipped model that really centers on community. There's an organization called Outlier in Detroit that actually started with two-way communication through text message with its communities because they wanted to basically help people in their time of need. And their theory is like, when you're getting evicted from your house, you need help right now, a story about a policy that'll help you in a couple of months would be great, but also what do you do right now? So that's how they started, and they have now launched a newsroom with professional journalists that not just respond to those text messages, but turn that into investigative pieces. Let me see, what's another good one to call out? City Bureau, I don't know how many of you, show of hands, have heard of Documenters? A few? Okay. So Documenters, you've got it here in Ohio, in Cleveland and in Akron. It was a program that was started in Chicago where an organization called City Bureau created a way to train and pay residents to document public meetings that were no longer getting covered by reporters. And it's really just kind of stenography, but it was a real way to get people involved in their government and to become observers and to do a service to their community and what the Signal Cleveland team calls a civic side hustle. So out of that, lots of people became interested, and now they are in cities across the country, and Ohio's documentary programs are among the bright spots in their network. So that's just an example of ways that nonprofit news has been able to innovate in terms of doing really strong traditional journalism, but also going beyond that and changing the way we think about it so that it is more directly responsive to what people want. And with that, I'm just going to show a video about Documenters to give you an example of what the program is like.
Journalism is at an inflection point. To put it bluntly, it's in danger. But there are those trying to help change that, from major philanthropies donating hundreds of millions of dollars to everyday men and women who are doing their part. Enter the Documenters, a group empowering local community members to attend public hearings, meetings, and then report back. It's the everyday run-of-the-mill heroics that often go unseen and are rarely celebrated. Here's their story.
Good evening. Are any of you registered to give public comments this evening?
When I was in the 8th grade, my history teacher, Mrs. True, said that nosy people like history. And although I don't really consider myself a nosy person, I do love learning about peoples and cultures.
My name is Kelly. I'm with Signal Cleveland and the Cleveland Documenters.
And I do believe it's our responsibility because it's a representative government.
Are you guys familiar with Signal Cleveland and the Documenters? So we're Signal Cleveland, it's online news, and we document the meeting every week.
Every single day, people are making decisions about their lives, and people have no idea until it actually becomes an issue for them.
This edition of the Barberton Herald marks the end of an era.
For the newsroom employees who lost their jobs today, there is also concern that local journalism will suffer as more and more journalists are shown the door.
This week's edition is focusing on the new middle school that's being built. You won't find that story in the New York Times.
Will city councils go uncovered? Will shady business deals go uncovered?
A recent news ecosystem study done by the Cleveland Foundation and the Knight Foundation found that only 11% of the news produced in Cleveland about Cleveland, only 11% served a critical information need.
There are hundreds of places in the United States that are absolute local news deserts, and that means there is no local news. We've divorced the way we inform ourselves from the geography of where we live in. How do you elect people? You elect them by districts that are geographically determined. That's a train crash begging to happen. One of the things we're doing at Knight Foundation, we've spent literally hundreds of millions of dollars funding local news experiments to try to find the model that will work both to engage audience and to make it a business.
Alrighty, calling this Cleveland City Council meeting on October 23rd, 2023 to order. Alright, we will now move to public comment. Our first person here.
Even though these meetings are open to the public, very little of the information from these meetings gets out to residents, even though the whole reason why they are open to the public is to make sure that the residents can get the information from these meetings.
I stand before you today as a proud resident of Ward 15, a mom of two beautiful girls.
So we train folks and we pay them to go to these meetings and then document these meetings.
Thank you all for allowing me the opportunity to present public comment tonight.
I don't have an agenda or a spin. I'm just writing from a layperson's position as I see it and what I see as important. And that's the whole point, that anyone can be a documenter. It doesn't require any special level of education.
When I heard about Signal Cleveland coming together, the first thing that people talked about is helping form this newsroom was the documenters. I mean, in a nutshell, I saw this as sort of this potential to help change up declining resources at most news organizations.
Thanks for joining us today to learn and to share about documenting public meetings. We have around 700 folks who have signed up, and then I believe it's somewhere around 400 or so folks who have actually attended an orientation or training. Becoming a documenter is a relatively simple process. For anyone interested in documenters' work, you don't have to take assignments. You actually don't even have to have signed up at documenters.org to join us here.
They're not writing stories, they're just recording what they're seeing and hearing.
When we started, there was no record. There was nobody doing this. And so there's no examples of how to do it.
We look for news that I can then draw out as a story or assign to someone or use it in a newsletter. It's become invaluable.
Today is really going to be about the election. There are a couple questions. The big question is, what questions do you all have about this election coming up?
Madam Clerk, first reading emergency ordinances to be passed.
Ordinance 1024-2023, determining the method of making the public improvement of construction.
I really feel like we have an impact. A good example of this happened to us relatively early on. We're covering a Cleveland City Council meeting, and somebody was presenting, but it was relatively wonky, like any city department might be. One of the council members stopped them and said, "Hey, we have documenters in the room. So could you roll back and actually explain that in a little bit more clear way so that residents can understand?" That's a huge impact.
Do you happen to have a copy of the community calendar? Just wanted to see what was heard today. Thank you.
I can't underestimate the potential to local democracies and local democracies nationwide of having this group of folks who are attending local meetings.
It's we, the people, who are here to make a difference and make lives better for ourselves and our neighbors.
Journalism, especially local journalism, is evident.
That was Kelly, one of the most prolific Cleveland documenters, and she's amazing. She's a fountain of story ideas every time I talk to her. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark and Mary Ellen in a second to talk and give some examples about how all of this manifests into the full package of journalism that Signal Ohio provides. They often refer to their model as a flipped model. That's really just because it's still got the same components that you would have seen in a newspaper in any decade, but in addition to that, they are spending a lot more time in community. They have reporters who do office hours in public spaces and are constantly listening to sort of what questions and concerns people have, and that really helps guide the sort of agenda for reporting, like what is it that people are actually wondering about and what do they care about. And they also just have, as you saw, built this really vibrant community of hundreds of people actually now who are trained to do this work. And even if not all of them take assignments, it's really inspiring to go by their newsroom and see how many people show up to their community events and really just want to be around each other because they're just people who are mutually invested in the future of Cleveland. So with that, I'll turn it over to them. But thank you so much, and I look forward to the conversation.
Can you hear me?
Maybe use the mic.
Is this better?
You're fine. I'll turn it on from over here.
Okay, sorry.
And I'm supposed to mute that.
All right, so go ahead, Mary.
Can you hear me now?
Sorry, sounds like a Verizon commercial.
Is this better?
No.
No, maybe I can just project.
Keeps going to this one.
Yeah, maybe just project.
Oh, wait, hold on. Oh, no, that says handheld.
Is there a button on that handheld?
There might be.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, that made
Now
the
that should
difference.
do it.
Hello?
Yep.
The high tech. Sorry about that. So I have been working with the documenters as the copy editor, making sure that the names are spelled right and that the ordinance numbers are correct. But our documenters are covering meetings that no established journalism place has been able to cover, like Cleveland City Council Safety Committee meetings, Health and Human Services Committee meetings. We cover the Planning Commission, the Board of Zoning Appeals, the RTA Board, the Housing Board. It's just a matter of citizens listening to what officials are doing with public money. And we find stories out of what the RTA, our bus system is doing, how they are modernizing their equipment. And actually, this is my fun little party fact. A new bus for RTA costs $632,000. Nobody really has any idea how much a bus costs. So we've been really pleased with all the information that the documenters will uncover. And while there are minutes of meetings, nobody looked at them before, but now you have citizens who are actually looking at what the government bodies are doing. And the idea, it should help our elected officials be more on the straight and narrow, because people are paying attention to what they're doing.
That's really the heart of what we do. I'm going to jump over with my screen because I'm going to give you some examples of stories that came out of documenters, some not so obvious. I'll turn this one off now.
Sure.
Could I ask just one clarifying question?
Yes.
I'm just trying to understand the relationship between documenters and Signal. Is it the same organization? Are they two separate organizations? They're just collaborating?
It is the same organization. The newsroom has teams. I would say the documenters is it's not the only community engagement work that you all do.
Correct.
But maybe you want to explain it in more detail?
Cleveland Documenters started 4 years ago. We had money for just documenting meetings in Cleveland, and we are connected to City Bureau in Chicago, but we are our own place, and then we are the heart of the Signal newsroom. 2 years after we started, we hired editors, reporters that actually take the information that the documenters are finding and turn it into stories instead of just 6 pages of notes from a given meeting.
So it's Signal staff that do the documentary.
Are the documenters paid or volunteers?
They're paid. I think it's about $17 an hour, and it's a minimum of 3 hours. So the idea is that we value your time, but it's nobody's full-time job. The most active documenter will get an assignment, will get 2 to 3 assignments a month. But as Loretta said, civic side hustle.
May I interrupt with one last? Do they have security issues?
No, we have been surprised at how welcome the documenters have been, really at every meeting. You know, we didn't know when we started if people would say, you know, who are these people coming in? But, you know, Cleveland City Hall or, you know, all the places we cover are public agencies. And the public is allowed into these buildings. You have to go through a metal detector, but no, the officials have been very fine with having us there, and I think many of them probably like having their name appear somewhere. You
I
know,
was wondering more about the audiences that resent coverages.
We haven't run into that.
Reporters have run into it, so I was wondering if the documenters have.
Oh, you mean like security personal security for the documenters themselves?
Oh, I think the documenters themselves aren't necessarily.
You've explained.
Yeah, that recognized, and it's really very straight coverage. And the safeguard is that, you know, it's a citizen who's taking the notes, but then I and one of my colleagues read everything. So, you know, the stuff is very not biased, very straight, we think.
And I think an editor there someplace now?
I'm one of there are two editors, yes.
Okay, and every article then is
Read by two of us.
I would clarify too that the documenters, the aim of the program is to make it approachable and accessible for people, so without training. So they're not asked to write prose and articles that are like an inverted pyramid and things like that. What they're doing is taking notes in a templatized format so that people can get a digest of what they observed, and the analysis and everything else comes with the additional reporting from the professional newsroom.
Right.
Yeah, and these are all lead right into the next point. So you did see in that piece Lawrence Caswell, who's the managing editor of the Documenters program. So it does operate like just a different arm of that newsroom. I've always described it as a Trojan horse of news just waiting to be, you know, unveiled. I started at the Plain Dealer when we had enough reporters there to actually cover all those meetings individually. That doesn't happen anymore. And that's where and why it's so important. They come in and they're listening. The biggest developer in the region is the Cleveland Metro Parks, and the major media no longer has any reporter going to their meetings. The documenters, that was added to our list not long ago, and it's flush with information that could be brought out. But you were asking about like an editor. Like, I want to be clear that the document created by the documenters is notes. We don't portray it as a story. It doesn't have, you know, different things vetted or called. That's when it gets turned over to a reporter. A documenter noted recently, not too long ago, let's see, August of this year, that there was a hot dog vendor who comes up year after year because they deny his permit because he likes to set up outside the West Side Market, and the councilman that represents the West Side Market doesn't want any competition for the West Side Market. That's a great story. And so that gets turned over to a City Hall reporter, and he wrote a story about the hot dog standoff, and the hot dog vendor wins his case. But that's something that would have never been out there. And there's a lot of good issues in that come through in that idea of, you know, sort of the parochial side of what a councilman's doing. Hey, we're all for jobs in Cleveland, but not this job. That's just one small example. There are more serious examples that come through the notes. Mary Ellen flags them each week. We try to get to them. We have limited staff, so they have to balance chasing something from the documenters with what they're doing on their normal beat reporting. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what is a signal story, how do we fit in, and kind of how do we try and need to be different. And our beat reporters do things differently. We have a dedicated K through 12 reporter, which is really rare in this day and age. IdeaStream has a dedicated K through 12 reporter. That is our public radio station out of Cleveland. But he has to cover 21 counties. Our K through 12 reporter is focused, you know, again, around what we started, which was the hole in coverage of Cleveland that no one is covering anymore. So he gets to spend more time on Cleveland. That's important. He does things like not just tell the problems of the school levy, the budgeting, but he also tries to tell the stories of the students and the youth. That's why our beat is K through 12/youth, because pretty much anything happening in Cleveland with youth is someone in school. they get zero coverage. We give that. And we did something a little different when we filled this position after our first reporter who came from the documenter side, became a reporter, may not have had the polish of a writer, but he became so interested in it, he went to grad school, so he's in New York now in an element of journalism. The new reporter we filled the position with is a visual reporter. So he primarily does video and photography. So that's kind of hard way to get your mind around covering a K through 12 beat, which can be, pretty monotonous. But he does a good job of balancing that, going to every meeting, as well as looking for student stories. Just one example, he recently did a story about refugees. These are youth, these are people attending schools. You will not find any news organization dedicating this kind of time and quality if you look at these photos that I'm about to show you. I mean, this is a story that talks about the space. This is at a very artistic as well as journalistic level. He does numerous videos. For example, when there was a program in the Cleveland schools to teach people about food management and culinary skills, they actually launched their own food truck. Mikey, who is the reporter, was with them doing a video about it. But this is the kind of work and time that we've decided is necessary, that makes us stand out, but gives us a different view of things that you will not get somewhere else. I get very passionate on it because it is work that, we don't have the massive audience yet, but people are seeing it, and this is what separates us from others. That's just one example. This is another example by Mikey. So not a video story, but the report cards came out where Cleveland schools were essentially trying to brag that, hey, we did pretty well. Everybody are rates up. But then we took a dive on actually that more than half of the schools actually didn't do better, but they were buoyed by the better magnet schools and closer schools. So that's taking a more serious look, but that's one example of how we can be different and are different because, as you mentioned, Loretta mentioned earlier, the need to get that audience so big. That's as a survival for some of the legacy media. I spent 19 years in the legacy media. The Cleveland Plain Dealer, Cleveland.com, does a regular feature on what Taylor Swift tickets cost anywhere in the world. Argentina, Atlanta, I think yesterday I saw one for Toronto, because they can get clicks on that, and they might argue, and I know they do, that, well, sure, people in Cleveland might fly somewhere to go to see her. That's fine. But that's still an eyeball grab, and they have to do things like that. We all have our challenges of getting eyeballs, the big funnel in, but that's a decision of resources. So again, that's where we try to stand out a little bit differently. Probably where we stood out the most, if you look at election coverage from the last two cycles, is this. Let me click on the right button, hold on. This is really interesting. When I look at the numbers of the most popular story on election night is not who won the president, the U.S. Senate, or going back to the last March in the primary, it was who won the judges' races. And we were trying to get ahead of that this was a collaboration with the Marshall Project, another nonprofit, that tried to tell you, all right, we've got in Cuyahoga County, probably in a lot of places, if anybody ever listened to Serial a few years back, they talked about how our courthouse is full of judges with all the same name, or they're somehow related. That is confusing.
But they're certainly Irish.
Yeah.
Marshall is legal news, is that correct?
Marshall Project is focused on social justice issues, from police to courts, in that realm. Very specific, very deep dive, investigative work. They care about the courthouse and the judges, so they help. So we created this guide. A colleague of mine that works a little bit with both organizations. This was very popular. We actually printed this and distributed it at bus stations. because we knew where to reach people in Cleveland. And it may not have been this one. It was a version we did on like the juvenile court justice candidates and stuff like that. But you're just not finding it anywhere. No one spends time on judges. And to see that to be the top story on our election night, when you look at the numbers, says a lot about the need and where we're trying to fill in. Yeah.
As you were scrolling down, I noticed something in common. Nearly everyone who's there did not respond to questions submitted by Cleveland.
Yeah, well, that's not an affront to us. The same set of judges typically ignore the bar associations when they do their rating systems. But we were still able to provide some information. I think one of the most important one, let's see if it's in this one, was pointing out that one of the judges running, Mr. Joseph O'Malley, I'll read you what we made sure the public knew, regained his law license after it was suspended following the 2011 federal convictions for lying to the FBI and failing to report a federal crime. He is the brother of the juvenile court administrative judge, Tom O'Malley, and the late domestic relations judge, Kathleen O'Malley. And finally, he co-owns a bar in the Flats called Little Buddies. So that's information that I can assure you you are not getting in many places, and makes, an example of the kind of work we try to do to stand out. We recently, launched a statewide bureau focused or centered in Columbus, but not on just the news that happens in State House Square, because I think that's the problem that we have. A lot of that, some of the strongest writing and reporting we can find out every detail of everything going on with those, with the lawmakers, yesterday's lame duck session, the battles for the speakership, but it doesn't seem to extend beyond that to what we always reference as the front porch. HB 6, the big scandal on First Energy. How does it affect the person in Steubenville? We're all focused on so much about the crime and the corruption, which is obviously the issue, but what does it mean? What is it, the trickle-down effect been? That's what we're trying to do with the State House coverage, and we're trying to make that connection a little bit more, not race to be like everyone else on the State House, but draw it out a little bit further. Here's an example of today's newsletter. We are coming out of an election cycle, but I thought since this guy is somewhat local, Tim Ryan told us yesterday that he's sort of back into thinking about running again for office. That's inside politics. That is, part of that mission out of there, and that gives. That's the beauty of it, right? He's got options. Governor's race. See what happens with the candidate that Mike DeWine picks to fill J.D. Vance's role. So there's more to come on that. But Andrew is plugged in well. But is also already looking to expand. He notes yesterday that they passed, a ban on transgendered bathrooms at public schools, K through 12 and high school. We have a higher ed reporter who will take that and now try to really get at the issue of was it an issue anyway? What schools even had those bathrooms? How long have they had them?
It was a great non-issue.
Well, maybe that's what we get at. But the idea is to get beyond the State House, because I can assure you a lot of organizations probably won't go past the fact that it got passed, and then we won't know more. So that's an idea of how we can use that State House to kind of look deeper into policies and connect. And yell out questions you have, and I'm wrapping up so that we have more time for questions.
So if you have a documenter at a meeting, like say Cleveland Metropolitan School District Board meeting, does that mean that the reporter does not go?
No, and in that case, we do have the reporter at K through 12. Mikey is always at him. And we also have documents, because documenters there. There's often a lot of information. The reporter usually has an idea of something on the agenda that he's got to focus on, something that's more daily relevant. And he doesn't have the ability, he or she, to focus on all the other stuff in the meeting. Documenters often pick up that. In a perfect world, you would like to not have overlap if you can avoid it, but in some of these cases, like the Cleveland schools and other meetings, there's too much, even for a reporter, because they're trying to turn a story, and you pretty much, as soon as I get my quotes or a story as a reporter, I'm out, like mentally. I'm already writing on the computer and I'm not listening.
Well, if I could add something
Yeah.
really fascinating, if you all ever want to look at Documenters' documents, they're public records as soon as they're produced, so they're on a website for anyone to use, so any newsroom could access them as well. One of the really interesting things that comes out of those notes are the Documenters' questions, because they come from a genuine, like, they're not professional. So the questions that they ask can be very like, actually, more people should know about that. And some really amazing stories that the Signal Cleveland newsroom has done have been born out of those questions.
I have it up for
Okay,
them
great.
to look.
Go ahead.
No, so this is it. This is exactly what it is. So these live on a website, and then if we are doing a story based on notes, you will find a link. And, here's an example of just a couple of the different things, but let me pull up one so you can see it in. Few people cover public housing anymore. But, you will find on this first both information about the board, the meeting times, the regularity of it. We'll link to the agendas, and then when the meeting's over, you'll be able to go and find the notes. And here they are. And they're pretty clean, and you would be able to know what happened at that meeting.
You also can look at the summary and, for your 30 seconds, you get a good sense of what happened. And then the documenter's questions follow.
And documenters' questions are just simply things that the person sitting there who may not be an expert in government had, on their mind. And that's actually a really great starting point in a way to not ignore what average people think. News can't always be driven by, the reporter's view of the world, because you miss things. So that's available. That's always there. We link to those in the stories. There is so much information in there that's still untapped, both by the public and by us reporters, but it's out there. Here's an example of another Signal Cleveland story in a more traditional sense. So Nick Costell came over from Public Radio, covers government for us. So much going on the stadium, as you know. This was back last May. We asked ourselves, what has the Browns Stadium cost taxpayers in total since it was built, began to be built in 1997? We know what the stadium cost at the time and who put in what, but there's been bonds and all of, refinancing, additional money for repairs through the sin tax. No one had a figure, and part of the story explains that no one really kept track, and the city only had it through a certain amount of time, but we actually did come up with a number that is around $350 million to taxpayers. It doesn't include what the private side put in. Those are things we feel are valuable to try to do. That's an example of some things.
So, my impression, I might be wrong, is that Signal Cleveland and Documenters are both very much focused on the city of Cleveland. I happen to be a Shaker Heights resident, so my question is, how do you think about the suburbs where most of us live?
Well, I'll tell you that it comes up a lot. It's really an issue of capacity. We have talked about where we want to expand to. We've already given sort of permission to our K through 12 to begin looking at immediate inner ring suburbs with schools, whether it's Warrensville Heights or others. We get the request all the time to go into those other suburbs, but there's a lot of things that are required that just you wouldn't be thinking about because I didn't know. You just don't think about it. Do they have a public agenda that's up regularly that can be scraped by the internet that allows us to begin getting it into a system where we can track it, assign it, and it's just so much more work that goes behind the scenes than people recognize. That's simply the reason we're not there. I think our readership reflects the fact that Lakewood, Shaker, the Euclid, the inner rings, they are reading us and would love to see that. But we started, as Signal Cleveland for the purpose of trying to still fill in that hole, and we know there's holes all over the place. So it is just an issue of management, capacity, funding to get there.
Doing a little lobbying.
Yeah, it's all good. Shaker's a big audience for us, sir.
At this point, do you know, obviously you really know how many people are reading your publication, but how about who they are? Do you know who's reading
Yes, on both to a certain extent, as much as anyone know, right? We are proud to say that our readership includes every zip code in Northeast Ohio and beyond. We can track that both through the people that subscribe to our newsletters, but you can see where people are coming. Everybody's savvy enough to know now that, like, the website itself, is not what attracts people. It's a Google search, so we know where a story's coming from, what they read first, but we see the audience growing, and that's our concern. We started with 0 clicks. If you see this little thing up here, it looks like a birthday party, because tomorrow is 2 years to the day that we hit the publish button. So we went from 0 clicks, to hundreds of thousands of page views a month now, a couple 100,000. That's small compared to, say, a legacy media that's been around for 200 years plus and 20 plus years already on the internet. That's all we're looking at. So we do know exactly the audience, and we look at things like how many are new visitors, how many are regular. We can break it down into, we love to see what our most frequent visitors like to read, and then how that adjusts what gets read. We want to make sure that we pay attention to what people want. So when we write about housing, it was a shock to me how much is consumed. One of the biggest stories in the last 12 months was how to get vouchers for public housing. I mean, that was beating the Browns stories and other things like that. So we pay attention to kind of see what people want, the judges stuff. We put more investment into that because we notice people must really be hungry for it. And we're not chasing stuff like Taylor Swift tickets. Like, so our stories, we could gin up the numbers if we played that, but we're trying to do it within the balance. And then we'll jump over to.
Regarding vouchers, vouchers for readership, where people would maybe be able to either taxpayer funded or foundation funded or whatever. But you get to subscribe to so many places or make it a dollar amount that you can scatter around or whatever.
You mean to help someone? Well, we're free, always, forever, and I can't. I mean, if the suggestion is we should make money available for others to be able to read other newspapers, I think is really the question for them, because everybody does dynamic pricing, so they're looking at a zip code, and they're not putting up a paywall for a reader in Cleveland on a certain zip code. They will in Shaker Heights. That's how that works, because they're going to say, this guy's got money, we're going to hit him with the paywall. So you get free stories. That's how it works. I know it sounds ruthless, but that's what it is. Yes, sir.
I'm curious what any of you think about the practicality of having a nonprofit newsroom here in Youngstown. Is this market big enough, and do we have the financial resources to support it?
I think that the Signal Ohio model, the idea is that should communities want a newsroom, that at the very least, it shouldn't take starting a whole, it's very difficult to start a new organization. You need a lot of funding to ensure you don't go away in a couple of years. The creation of the sort of backbone that Signal Ohio provides in terms of like governance, there's a local governing board of the organization. There's an executive team, there are business and operating capacity, so that all of those things already exist that a local newsroom can tap into, so that, for example, Signal Akron, Akron being a smaller community as well, was able to start with a 9-person newsroom because they were able to benefit from the sort of shared capacity. Mary Ellen edits for both newsrooms as an example. So I think that basically where there's a will, there's a way, I would say. But it does take, the question is really, can there be a local news movement here for local news? Is there interest in it? Because if there is, certainly Signal Ohio and the American Journalism Project would love to help in any way that we can.
So obviously, you have a certain economy of scale at Signal Ohio, so you can support newsrooms in other cities besides Cleveland. You already have one in Akron. I guess I'm asking what would it take to establish a nonprofit newsroom here in Youngstown, either through Signal or some other entity?
How much?
It depends on how big you want to go. So, and it's a little bit of a sort of back and forth on that. So you could start small, but what we would suggest in terms of what AJP sees as a way to do it sustainably is to raise at least a couple years of the budget you want to run up front, because in order to hire talented people who are willing to give up whatever job they're at right now, if they've, you know, like a lot of journalists have unfortunately left journalism. They're probably, you know, in communications or some other industry. If you want to bring them back into journalism, it's going to take saying, I can cover your salary for at least a couple years. I've got a business team that's going to keep raising money for that. So, you know, if you wanted to start like a 5-person newsroom, you want to at least raise enough money to ensure that you can cover those folks for a while, and then and then you go as big as you can depending on the community. I think in Akron, it's been really inspiring to see the local corporations come together and contribute to them. They raised, I think, over $5 million to start with their 9-person newsroom. And they're, you know, and they've got major donors coming in and things like that. So you would be surprised. I think that it's really, I think Youngstown is a place where a lot of people really love the city. You have cultural institutions. So I think there's a lot of potential here. The question is like, how much do people want it?
You could maybe start with just a documentaries program,
Yeah.
which is just one full-time person overseeing everything, and then a budget for paying the documenters.
And that's what's happening in Cincinnati, as the first step towards a newsroom there was with the documenters. Because of everything we said, it really becomes the heart, both as an information soul for the paper, but also that really on point and on mission that we want to connect to the community and engage. That makes sense. And plus you then have the backbone of the documenters in Cleveland going all the way to Chicago, so that's in place. So it makes sense. You take a small step. Mm-hmm. I mean, yes, Akron raised $5 million plus, but that is really, I know it's like a shoestring, right? Like, I mean, it is very expensive. I mean, we have an office, nothing fancy, but we put it on a bus line on purpose so that we knew that the community events and the people that we are helping serve needed public access. We have hired big journalists to come join us because that does make a difference. You know, everything, personnel, plumbing, and parking is what I joke about dealing with as a managing editor, because those are all the realities. There was no HR department. We had no credit card to begin with because we were waiting for status. You know, we were buying things and it's fun to talk about, but it is very expensive, and $5 million is a start that has to grow, and so for perspective.
Can I pursue that and ask you then, so you mentioned it being more a 6-person or a 5-person office if it were to start in like Youngstown. So let's make that $3 million. Compare that to what would put a price tag on a documentary startup.
So the documenters program, what it entails is not just payments to the documenters, but the like 1.5 people it takes to edit and like do the assignments and things like that. I hesitate to get ahead of the Signal Ohio CEO on this, so I might actually, if I could, get back to you on that. But it's depending on how long you want to sustain it or what the plan is to integrate it into a bigger newsroom at some point.
I thought maybe Cincinnati was a budget that you might have.
Cincinnati is interesting because they're in talks to grow a significant newsroom around that. So hopefully a subsequent announcement will be more money. But yes, I'm sorry not to, I'm a journalist, so I don't want to say things that are untrue.
Yeah. It's less than $1 million.
Yeah.
I know that a coalition of funders came together for the Cleveland, Signal Cleveland, and I had the pleasure of going into that space and trying to park my van in that parking lot.
It can be a challenge.
It's not the most fun to get in and out of, but I like the fact that it's publicly located and in the middle of everything. But my question is really around getting funders engaged. You had Cleveland Foundation, the Knight Foundation, and others for your birthday party years ago when it started. And I understand that was about $5.8 million originally. did the American Journalism Project approach Cleveland, or was there a groundswell of people in the community saying, we want this? I understand it's a chicken or egg question,
Yeah.
but really what came first? Because maybe that's a model we need to look at here. Did it come from the people saying, well, now that, you know, the Plain Dealer and the Cleveland Press, which have been gone for decades, are now gone, how do we get the news that we need about our schools and City Hall?
That's a great question. It actually, Cleveland Foundation had been for years before we met them, doing some work, trying different experimental investments in media, because they actually, I think it was their comms team that really saw it was just hard to get information out about programs. Like, they would offer a service and no one would know about it. So they started looking into it. They also, I think, were really motivated by solving the issue of illiteracy rates in Cleveland, which are quite high. And through that, just like learned about the impact of the loss of local news on their communities. They had built kind of brought a coalition together of local foundations. So it was, I think, as many as a dozen different people in a room. And they decided to basically approach the American Journalism Project for just like, is there anything that you can kind of help like advise us on in terms of what we can do? That led us to this community listening effort and sort of hearing from people, doing focus groups and things like that, trying to understand what it is that Clevelanders really wanted from local news. And then we sort of worked together to grow that coalition to new funders and new donors that maybe hadn't been on their radar.
Earlier you had talked about gauging interest in communities, whether it's for wanting local news or even like the topics they'd be looking for. Can you go into how? Is it like a surveying process, or is it more people coming together and waiting to see what they have to say, like in a public forum?
Well, there are ways that AJP does it. I know Signal Cleveland has lots of opportunities, interactions with their community through office hours, that they have a community reporter named Najee who is always out in the field, and also communities of practice for documenters where people sign up and actually come and like have a lot of really vibrant discussion. For AJP, when we go to a place, we want to reach the most like people who are not frequently surveyed. So that can be really difficult. We start with sort of like trying to get a sense of like who are the organizations that are doing grassroots work. We reach out to grasshops leaders, but we don't just survey them. We say, how can we reach these other folks that are like not typically invited to the table? We do focus groups in different languages if we know that language barriers can be an issue. And I think regulations may prevent us from doing this in the future, but we got really great responses from text messaging because you get a pretty consistent return rate of 1% to 2% on any text message that you send. And we design our surveys to be just like to not exclude people who don't consider themselves political or like to be news junkies. We don't use overuse words like journalism and news. We're just like, what information is going to get you through the week? If you need to find something out about your community, where do you go that you can trust? And you would be really surprised how engaging people are when they respond across the political spectrum, across age. People really are craving that connection to what's happening locally. And but there is also a lot of distrust in local institutions.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Any other questions?
I get the signal. I like to read it. It's good writing, good headlines, even though I'm not from Cleveland. But I always scroll through and kind of lament that there's no advertising in it. I wonder if that's part of your plan. Do you hope to attract more sustainable income, or do you got to go back to the foundations every year to keep going?
The idea is that there will be advertising revenue. The way these things work tends to be because advertising revenue follows eyeballs, so you do need to start with philanthropy, or it can help. That's not always the case. There's an organization called Block Club Chicago that started mostly with membership revenue, but that was because they were the staff from something called DNA Info, which was a hyperlocal publication. And when that collapsed, they started a Kickstarter, and all of their readers from DNA Info basically contributed their own money to start that organization. in AJP's sort of like portfolio, we see that some of the more mature news organizations have a pretty even split between advertising, membership, which is like small donations, and institutional philanthropy. And that's the sort of platonic ideal. Like every community is going to be different, but basically that makes you more resilient because sometimes the ad market takes a dive or whatever. Eventually, when Signal gets to a certain size, hopefully advertisers will come. In Akron, there are some corporate sponsors that helped start Akron too.
Yeah, and on Loretta's point, the 3 pillars, the foundation, and then donors, which you could also think of as your subscribers, like in public media, they give to you because they like the product. That's really important, and that's growing well for us because that doesn't need the eyeballs as much as people need to appreciate the content. And then the advertising. We've had a handful of advertisers in the last couple, Liquid IV, you know, the mix, because they're part of a consortium of like of corporate companies that specifically want to do more for the nonprofit world. So, you know, there was a service that helped line that up. But that is really the point. If you think about it, 2 years ago we had 0 clicks. It was really hard to sell an ad going into the launch. Now we have a lot more data to point to because that still matters to some people, but we have a niche too. Like we know we can say here's where that audience is. And the point about really zeroing on the community. We have good writing, and that's elevated writing. We are very aware of not everybody has the same interest in what we write or level of reading, or they don't want or are not familiar with websites. So that is why we do print materials at times, because it's the best way to reach someone. We know that most traffic, of course, comes from a phone, so you have to be positive, or really thinking how that can connect. Social media, we're growing those channels, creating content specifically for people who will only see information through that, right? I'm the dinosaur legacy media, right? You would create a story and then you would try to fake it and do a TikTok version, but my teenager sniffs that out a mile away and knows that that's not authentic and it's not going to work. So you really have to be able to speak to them, that audience, those readers, in a language that connects, and that's what you're trying to do. It's all keeping the plates spinning here.